Representative Cardin is well known to all of you, but for the one or two of you who don't know him, I'll remind you that Representative Cardin is a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh. He graduated with honors. He's a graduate of the University of Maryland Law School, where he was first in his class. He served in the Maryland House of Delegates for 20 years. For 7 of those years, he was the Speaker and served on the Ways and Means Committee as its chairman for a half a dozen years. He's been in the Congress of the United States representing the 3rd Congressional District since 1987. He's presently the Assistant Democratic Whip, a member of the Ways and Means Committee and the Budget Committee, and a member of the Helsinki Commission, which deals with, as you know, security and cooperation in Europe and especially human rights. And it's in conjunction with that responsibility and interest that he's going to speak tonight, although the topic is broader than simply human rights. Representative Cardin this January was in Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey dealing with human rights questions on behalf of, with the Commission. The title tonight is The U.S. Role in the New World Order, Superpower or a Supercop. Representative Cardin.
Frank, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and congratulations for the great job that you do here. We're very proud of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. It brings a dimension to Baltimore that I think is extremely important, and I'm very proud that my community has this type of a council. Frank, I've spoken here before, but I think I need to at least correct one impression that you gave during the introduction. And that is, it is true that I did graduate from the University of Maryland School of Law first in my class, but you didn't give the order correctly. And trying to be open with our bios today, let me point out that I ran for the Maryland legislature between my 2nd and 3rd year as a law student. And after serving, after my 2nd year in law school, I was somewhere in the middle of my class, but then I was elected to the Maryland General Assembly, and my very first year was appointed to the committee that had the budget of the University of Maryland School of Law. I'm also very pleased to be here with my wife, Myrna, who is very active within the Baltimore Jewish community and within our community. If I get tough questions related to Israel, maybe I'll let either Myrna or Art Abramson answer those questions tonight. I was sort of pondering what qualifications I have to talk on foreign affairs, and then I realized I do serve in the Congress where you have 2 warring parties, and I think I have learned some diplomatic skills as to what is happening in Congress. In fact, some of the lessons that we learned internationally would really work very well on Capitol Hill these days. But it is a very important subject as to what the role of the United States should be as we enter the next millennium. There are foreign policy experts and political leaders are debating exactly what our role should be in the next millennium, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my views with you this evening. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, there's been more and more support in this country for the United States to take a smaller role, a diminished role, in international events. There are those who say that we have no real enemy, that there is no one who can invade our shores, and that we don't have any real military threat to the security of our nation. Therefore, why should we be so concerned in international events? There's a great deal of trade frustration out there in the community. Come to some of my town hall meetings when I talk to my constituents who believe that every time we get involved in anything that's international, it costs us jobs here in the United States, and they're very much concerned about any attempt to expand internationalism as it relates to commerce. And then we have problems here at home. We have very difficult budgets. We've had very difficult budgets. And there are those who say, look, if you have some money to be spent, shouldn't you spend it on job training for Americans here in the United States, or education, or roads? Why would you want to spend that on international efforts? After all, our priority should be to take care of our own people. This view has sort of come out in many of the issues that we're looking at in Congress. One of my colleagues from the Maryland congressional delegation has said openly and publicly that he doesn't believe that we should be spending any U.S. funds abroad unless there is a direct threat to the boundaries of our country. That's a pretty extreme view, but it's shared by several members of Congress. What we have done on the United Nations dues should be underscore this philosophy of perhaps we can do it alone and do not have to be involved internationally. It's embarrassing, at least to me, that the United States has not paid its UN dues. We've lost our position on the Committee on the Budget, where we could have directed some reform that is badly needed within the United Nations. And the Secretary General has informed us that we might lose our vote in the UN General Assembly. And yet, this Congress has done very little to move forward that issue on UN dues. To the contrary, every time they try to bring it up, they want to make it in a way that it would make it impossible for the President to sign the legislation that provides the funds, and they're not even bringing that up at this point. So this Congress is not concerned that much about the United Nations. IMF funding. You have the chairman of the Federal Reserve System who tells us that it's absolutely critical that we finance our obligations under the International Monetary Fund. We have our fiscal experts that say that if we provide the credits, there will be no cost to the taxpayers of this country. After all, we receive full security and full interest on all the funds that we put into the IMF. There is no risk. Our conservative budget people don't even score this for any potential cost to the taxpayers of this country. And yet we can't get IMF funding passed in the Congress of the United States. We have impending problems in Indonesia, Korea, and other Asian countries that could very well spill over to the United States, and yet we don't take the necessary steps in Congress to do something about it. And then there's the funding of the U.S. embassies. It's very interesting. I serve on a college board, and we had a problem in a foreign country, and we had difficulty in dealing with it because we didn't have enough people, U.S. people, in the embassy to deal with the problem. That's becoming a problem in many embassies around the world. Unless we get a wealthy ambassador who's willing to put his own funds into funding the their embassy, it's very difficult for us to get the type of congressional budget support for U.S. embassies abroad that serve so many important functions. And the budget that just passed the House of Representatives would require cuts in U.S. embassies of at least 10% and perhaps as high as 30%. I'm not talking about real dollars, I'm talking about absolute dollars below current funding levels. So when you look at it in real dollars, the cuts are even greater. So I come here tonight to tell you that there is a view in Congress, there's a view among my constituents, there's a view among the people of this nation that it's time for us to back up and be less aggressive internationally and spend more attention on the problems here in the United States. Well, I disagree with that philosophy. I believe that the United States has a unique responsibility as the only superpower in the world, as the only nation that can, in fact, do certain things internationally, and that we should be more active, more aggressive internationally than we have in the past. I believe in what it's in our interest, as Harry Truman said, and let me just quote if I might, when he said, "We have learned through the costly lessons of 2 world wars that what happens beyond our shores determine how we live our lives. The best way to prevent future wars is to work for the independence and well-being of all nations." Harry Truman was right in the 1940s when he said that. It's equally true today that we can and must be more involved internationally, and it's in our interest to do that. We are affected by international events. You know that, and I expect my colleagues do. Our economy is very much dependent upon the world economy. If there's a problem with oil in the Middle East, we'll feel it here in the United States in our stock market. The financial crisis in Asia has had effect and will continue to have an effect on our economy in the United States. It affects U.S. exports. We are very dependent upon exports, as we should be. The Port of Baltimore is a major economic part of our economy. We want cargo moving both in and out of the Port of Baltimore. U.S. investors are involved internationally that affect us here in the United States. And we all have been very happy, those of us who have had funds in our stock market, and would like to see it continue to grow. And yet we know that it's extremely sensitive to international events. We need to be involved internationally for economics. We need to be involved internationally for our environment. We need to provide world leadership on environmental issues. We need to be involved internationally against terrorism. We are vulnerable to terrorist activities here in the United States, and it's in our interest to work in the international forums to reduce the threat of terrorism. We want to stop drug trafficking. It wasn't too many years ago where the United States, because of foreign policy considerations, was not very strong against drugs coming into this country. We need to work with other countries to prevent drugs from coming into the United States. And the list goes on and on and on, and I could cite you so many different reasons as to why it's important for us to be global. Joe Stearns is here, so you can just read his old editorials, and he'll tell you all the different reasons why internationalism is so important to the growth of our country for U.S. interest. We are in a unique position to impact international events. I think some of the proudest moments in the history of the United States is when we stood strong, sometimes against the popular international sentiment for leadership internationally on moral issues. The Jackson-Vanik trade restriction against the former Soviet Union that said to the other superpower that we would not engage in free trade with the Soviet Union as long as they had human rights violations against its citizens in free mobility. Many other countries thought they could take advantage of that. We didn't have world support to what we were doing in the Soviet Union. And yet our action impacted the Soviet Union to the point that it became an international agenda item at summit talks in which we were able to impact on the practices within the Soviet Union, and by that affecting human rights around the world. Our sanctions against South Africa, the U.S. took the leadership role. We took the role of sanctions against South Africa when many of our allies did not take similar action. Yes, they followed, but that's what happens with the United States. We usually have to provide the leadership, and then other countries will follow. And we brought down the apartheid government of South Africa. We helped in the leadership that the United States played. And then most recently, the Dayton Accords for Bosnia. Yes, it would have been very easy for us to say this is a European problem. Why should the United States invest its resources and its troops in some part of Europe when Europe is not really interested in dealing with it? But thank goodness for the U.S. leadership, because we did stop the killings in Bosnia. We did stop the ethnic cleansing. We should have done it a couple years earlier, but at least we did take the action that was necessary. We did establish, but for the United States, there would not have been the war crimes tribunals established for Bosnia, former Yugoslavia, and for Rwanda. And thank goodness that the United States provided the leadership for the war crimes tribunal. We exercise our leadership using moral standards, and how refreshing that is in this world. And we should be very proud of that. It's not inconsistent with the role that we should be playing. Now, we cannot dictate around the world. We should have learned that lesson from the 60s. We can't dictate. But I think Secretary Albright said it best when she says the United States is not the sole arbiter of right and wrong, but the pathfinder to show the way when others cannot. That's what we did in Bosnia. and we showed the way when others could not. Europe was hopeless, and we showed the way. Others followed our leadership. Yes, there are 34,000 troops now in Bosnia, of which 8,500 are U.S., but there are troops from Russia and Lithuania, the Greeks, the Turks, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Brits, the Germans, the French, the Canadians. They may not talk among themselves, but they work together in the United Nations in order to bring about peace in Bosnia. International groups are very important, but U.S. leadership is instrumental in those groups. Where will we be in the United Nations or NATO if it was not for U.S. leadership? And it's in our interest to expand NATO. I'm pleased to see that Czech, Poland, and Hungary will be added to the NATO, but we should also be looking at Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Romania for expansions in NATO. Myrna and I had a chance, as Dr. Byrd indicated, to visit two of our allies, Greece and Turkey, during this past winter. Both are NATO allies, and they're just about at war. They came very close to actually shooting at each other a few years back over a dispute over one of the Aegean islands. Both countries are extremely important to the United States, extremely important. Greece, a democracy, has very close economic ties with the United States. 1.1 million Americans of Greek ancestry help foster a very close relationship between Greece and the United States. They are not only our NATO ally, but allied during World War II, during Korea, and during the Cold War. Turkey has been a democracy since the 1920s, when Ataturk established a secular industrial state. It is a Muslim majority, which is one of our very, very few friends. That is Muslim majority, that is a democracy, a reliable ally that joined us in the embargo against Iraq. It's part of our Northern Watch for Bosnia, strategic location in an extremely hostile part of the world, along with Israel, our two only allies in dealing with Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And Turkey is willing to work with Israel. And yet Turkey has some very serious human rights problems. I did visit Turkey as part of the Helsinki Commission to go over and review the human rights records of Turkey. They have imprisoned parliamentarians for freedom of speech. The worst example is a parliamentarian who testified before the United States Helsinki Commission. I was present during that hearing when she testified before us as to the problems the Kurds were having within Turkey. I must tell you, her speech was effective, but rather objective. As a result of her speech, she was tried and convicted of treason. That's outrageous for a democracy. That's outrageous for our friend. This person is still in prison. We got to visit her during our visit. They impede freedom of speech. The Kurds in the southeast part of 3,500 of their villages have been destroyed, torture and killing of their people, closing of political parties. Now they're making some progress. Prime Minister Yilmaz is on the right track, wants to do the right thing, has some difficulty within his political system. He's established a Human Rights Council that has made some progress. The PKK and terrorism and their neighbors make it a very dangerous situation for Turkey. I understand that, but they have to make more progress. Now, I mention this because Greece and Turkey are having serious problems today. I don't think Americans quite understand how fragile the situation is over in that part of the world. We had a chance to visit Cyprus. Cyprus is a little island state in which they have a green line, where they have a border line between the northern part and the southern part, in which people are dying almost on a monthly basis. They shoot at each other across the line and kill each other at times. And that's been going on for over 20 years. The situation is that you have a country of less than 1 million people, 657,000 of Greek ancestry, 170,000 of Turk ancestry. The population is 80-20 split. The geography is a 63-37 split as a result of an episode that happened in 1974. 1974, the Greeks took certain action that the Turks reciprocated by sending over about 35,000 troops and took physical control of a large part of the island. Recently, the Greeks have indicated that they're going to put some missiles on there. It's a very dangerous situation in Cyprus. Well, and to make matters a little bit worse, the European community has taken sides here in favor of the Greeks. In a recent vote as to whether Turkey should be admitted to the European Union, the European Union denied Turkey's application for admission. At the same time, they moved forward to start the admission process for Cyprus under the Greek power. That only incited the Turks to be a little bit more militant, and Turkey is now talking about annexing the northern part of Cyprus, which would probably lead to open battle and war. Well, I just give you this background because nothing's happened in this area for 20, 25 years. It's a powder keg ready to explode, and will explode if nothing happens. Now, I must tell you, I'm willing to bet that 90% of Americans could not point out where Cyprus is on the map. But we know how important Greek and Turkey are to our country. What should the United States do? Well, I think this is an ideal example of where we should be exercising our international pathfinding role to find a solution. I congratulate President Clinton for sending Ambassador Holbrooke to the area. The prestige of our nation is on the line. I had a chance to meet with Mr. Denktash, who is the leader of the northern part of Cyprus, and Mr. Klarides, who is the president of Cyprus, the Greek area, who recently won re-election in February. Both agreed on one issue only. They didn't agree on much. In fact, they disagreed on just about everything. But the one thing they agreed upon was that, yes, they would like to see a solution for Cyprus. And the only way is if the United States is willing to commit itself to helping the Cypriots find a solution. That's the only way it's going to work. Only the United States can provide that leadership. It's in our interest to do it in order to get two NATO allies, two good friends, back in line with us in international events. We have enough enemies over that part of the world. We have enough problem spots that we don't have to have our friends fighting among themselves. And I think we can make progress. It will require some type of a bizonal federation. It will require some territorial adjustments. It will require the free movement of people and compensation for property losses. We know what the solution should be. And I think the governments of Turkey and Greece also understand what the solution will be. And there's not much disagreement about it. We just need to get the people talking. Well, there are many trouble spots beyond Turkey and Greece and Cyprus among the European areas. We have still a major problem in the former Yugoslavia. Just look at this morning's newspaper with Kosovo in the center of news. Kosovo is an area where you have a 90% Albanian population. It had autonomy of rule until Mr. Milosevic, the leader of Serbia, in 1989, took away the power of the people from Kosovo to control their own destiny. They now have virtually no control over their activities. The unemployment rate among Albanians in Kosovo is 80%. 80%. It is an area that's about ready to explode. Now, it may have already exploded to a certain degree. I hope that we've learned the lesson from Bosnia, and we don't wait 2 years to bring about a solution, to try to develop a solution on how to deal with Kosovo. Because if we leave Kosovo alone and we don't do anything, next will be Macedonia, and you'll have the same type of problems in Macedonia, where they have a 25% Albanian minority. So we have yet to resolve the problems in the former Yugoslavia. It does require an aggressive U.S. role, and we shouldn't be afraid to move forward in that area. Well, with Myrna here, I've got to talk a little bit about the U.S. role in the Middle East, so let me just talk for a moment, if I might. about what is happening in the Middle East. Mr. Netanyahu was just recently in Washington. I think he was very effective in meeting with congressional leaders and with the White House. I think some of the immediate crisis in the conflict between the United States and Israel has been somewhat resolved. He also stressed exactly what Mr. Clarides and Mr. Denktash said, and that is, we can't get anywhere without the United States. We need the United States. We are so unique in what we can do internationally, and it's true also in the Middle East. I also think we don't realize how much progress has been made in the Middle East. If you look at the period of time before the Oslo Accords, there were 2,500 separate instances of terrorism every year along the Israeli borders. Since Oslo, the number has been reduced from 2,500 a year to 200 a year. 200 a year is 200 too many, but we have made progress. Part of the Oslo Accords require deployment of autonomy and control over lands by the Palestinians. A large part of that has been implemented. Palestinians are living under Palestinian authority. It's working. The process is working. And yet we have a long, long way to go. We still have more territory that needs to be adjusted, and we have lack of enthusiasm among the Palestinian leaders to stop terrorism within the affected areas. But here, let me stress what Secretary Albright said. The U.S. must be the pathfinder. It can't dictate a solution. It won't work. The United States cannot dictate. It can only bring the parties together. And I hope that we'll continue our patience in the Middle East, and so that we can find a solution and peace in that area. If anyone questioned the need for U.S. leadership, I think the recent circumstances in India and Pakistan just cry out for, again, why only the United States is going to be able to help solve that part of the world. Nuclear arms race that we thought we had put an end to, at least among some of the more enlightened countries, is now very much a real threat. It reminds us that nuclear warfare is still with us. It's obviously in our interests to reduce that ability. India and Pakistan must take steps to sign the non-proliferation treaties and the comprehensive test ban treaties. Sanctions that we imposed were mandatory and required, but they won't solve the problem. It will lead to less stability in that region. I would acknowledge that. But we need to move forward in reducing the amount of nuclear capacity. We are very concerned over the spillover to Iran and Iraq. And Pakistan and India are not equal strength economies. So neither are the Pakistani government is much more subject to stability problems that we have to be very concerned about. So it is in our interest to make dialogue, active dialogue, possible. And I hope that, in fact, will become more of a reality. Well, I haven't even started to talk about China and Russia, and I've already spoken longer than I really had planned to, because I want to leave plenty of time for your questions and comments. So let me conclude by quoting from an observation of a former president, Theodore Roosevelt, when he said, "A man must first care for his own household before he can be of use to his state. But no matter how well he cares for his household, he's not a good citizen unless he also takes thought of the state. In the same way, a great nation must think of its own internal affairs, and yet it cannot substantiate its claim to be a great nation unless it also thinks of its position in the world at large." Those who know me know how aggressively I'm going to fight for the United States taking care of its own internal needs. We have a lot to do to help the people of our country. We are a great nation, and we must exercise the responsibility of a great nation. We can bring about peace and democracy in many parts of the world where it's lacking today, if we're willing to invest the prestige of this country. It doesn't cost much resources. It's more of our prestige and time. I hope that you will help me develop more support in our democracy for that role. For you see, the United States is a great democracy. A great democracy. I serve in the most democratic body in the world. I have to run for office every 2 years. You don't think that's democracy. The elections come up very frequently. And we like to be popular because we want to get reelected. And we reflect the sentiments of the people in our community. So we need more discussion, more dialogue as to what the U.S. role can be internationally. How is it important to the quality of life here in the United States? How will it affect my retirement funds? How will it affect the water I drink or the air I breathe? How will it affect the money that we spend for defense? How will it affect the jobs that my children will be able to receive? These are questions that are asked in my town hall meetings, that I try to say that by being aggressive internationally, in each of those cases, I can tell you that you're going to be better off if we invest some more time and, yes, some more resources in our international activities. But we need your help. You're here tonight to listen about international events, and I hope that you will help me in encouraging more discussion in our community as to the importance of the U.S. role internationally. Thank you all very much.
I saw a poll survey made recently by one of the NGOs, a non-governmental organization in Washington, very discouraged about the attitudes of what looks like the majority of the Congress with regard to international affairs. And so they studied the votes that had been made in the Senate and in the House, and found that you were one of the top percentage of all people in the Congress in terms of voting along the line of international responsibility. So I was very pleased to read that about you.
Must have been a very good NGO that did that polling. Their standards wasn't.
Well, this was the NGO called Campaign for UN Reform.
Oh.
And therefore I'm wondering if perhaps there aren't two steps that you might go along with. Not only do we need to be getting more conscious of our international responsibilities, but secondly, to be able to operate on the international global sphere, that we need to improve and reform UN structures to be more globally effective, while at the same time maximizing freedom, which is what the federal system does. Would you comment on that?
Very good point. I'm glad that you raised that. Clearly, we need to reform the international structure of the United Nations. There's no question about that. There has been some significant reform in the United Nations, but we need to move that forward. The most disappointing part is that we lost our seat on one of the major committees as a result of not paying our UN dues, which makes it more difficult for us. It also, just as a matter of human nature, it's very difficult for a state that is in arrears, that owes money, to try to influence the structure of an organization. Because they say, good, you're going to make some rules, but you're not living up to the current rules. You're not paying your dues. So we compromise our ability to get the type of reforms that are necessary. The United Nations needs reform. But the institution that needs the most reform is the IMF. The IMF needs significant change. And yet, if we don't pay our assessment, we lose our dominant role. We had the dominant role in the IMF. We have basically the right of veto. It is structured in a way where the United States is the dominant player. And we know the type of reforms that we want to bring about. And yet, it's going to be virtually impossible for our ministers to move forward on the reforms unless we pay our assessment. And to date, the IMF funding has not been made available by Congress. So you're right, we do need structural reform, but it's going to be difficult for the United States to get that structural reform unless we're in full compliance with the current responsibilities.
There are commentators who have said that this has been something provocative to the Soviet Union, encouraged militant nationalism in the Soviet Union, kindled the kind of resentment that might bring us back to the Cold War. What steps can we take in regard to the continued expansion of NATO to make sure that our relationship with Russia does not decline or even fall apart?
I think it's very difficult for us to predict the future relationship with Russia. It has not yet figured out what it wants to do yet. It has lots of problems as far as long-term direction for its country. Its political leadership is uncertain. I mention that not to frighten us, because it's a big country, it's a powerful country, that's true. I expect that it will it's not going to go back on reform. It's got to move forward on the reform. The people are not going to allow to go back on the basic freedoms that they're now enjoying. So I think you're going to find that Russia will continue along the path towards a more open and more democratic and more free economy and government. The important message, though, the United States must play, that as a nation is ready for membership in NATO, it should be offered membership in NATO. There should be a reward here. And the nations that we've invited to join NATO have followed the path that we asked. They are now open societies. They are now ready. They have Western values, basically, and they should be part of our NATO alliance. There are other countries that are now ready for membership, and we should not be concerned about Russia's view. I believe the more countries that become part of NATO, the more likely is that one day, and as sooner rather than later, that Russia could become part of NATO. I think that day will come. We're not ready for it yet. It's not within the next couple years, but I think it can happen. So, no, I don't think we should allow Russia's fear of Russia to slow down our expansion of NATO when it's appropriate. But we should be working to encourage the type of reforms within Russia that will give it more comfort. And lastly, let me say, I really don't think NATO is a threat to Russia. I don't think Russia believes that NATO is a threat to Russia. I really don't think they believe that. Russia is having problems among themselves. They have to figure out their country and how they're going to deal with the diversity within their country.
You cited the use of the Jackson-Vanik legislation against a superpower of the past because of its abuse of human rights. Is it now appropriate to use similar legislation against the superpower of the future because of its abuse of human rights? I refer, of course, to China.
Right. Well, I have never supported MFN for China. I've always voted against MFN for China. I've disagreed with the last 3 administrations on their policies towards China. Most recently with President Bush and with President Clinton. I think both listened to the State Department inappropriately and will cause future problems for our country. It's sort of beyond the rainbow, though, I must tell you. At this point, for us to try to now deal with taking away MFN would be extremely difficult. As a political matter, it's not going to happen. We're never going to get the necessary votes in Congress to take away MFN. But I thought it was wrong for us, particularly 5 or 6 years ago, to be financing through free and open trade, or fair trade, whatever you want to call it, with China, the types of oppressive practices that they did to their people. I thought it was wrong. I thought we should have exercised international leadership as we did with the Soviet Union. It was a little more complicated because the Soviet Union never had MFN, and China, you would be taking away MFN, so there is a difference here. But we worked out a compromise about 4 years ago, which I voted for and thought it was the right way to go. It required certain action for the president to move forward with in China. I don't think the president ever exercised the real leadership that we needed with China to get those reforms done within that state. And if he had, I think he would have succeeded. Now China doesn't really believe they have much to fear about MFN. They know that the president has his whole prestige on the line. So I don't think we're leveraging trade with China at all on human rights, and that's unfortunate. And we will, I'm afraid, regret that one day. Not that I expect it'll become a military situation, but I don't think we're going to make the type of progress on human rights that we could have made if we would have been more aggressive in this area.
As a person of Indian descent, I have a question, if you can help us reconcile this contradiction, which I see, that it is understandable that there was a mandatory sanctions imposed on both India and Pakistan in the context of the recent nuclear explosions there. But we see that, on the other hand, China has all these privileges So how do we reconcile all that? It seems like a contradiction of foreign policy from a layman's point of view.
I think you're right. I think it is a contradiction. Well, first of all, the United States has never tried to be consistent in every part of the world. We really have never professed that we're going to be consistent. We cannot be the policeman for every part of the world. We cannot exercise all the powers we have in every area where there's problems. But just because we can't do that, it doesn't mean we shouldn't act anywhere. Now, we have to impose sanctions against Pakistan and India because our law requires it. And the law, it was well intended. It was meant to prevent the testing. It was never thought that these sanctions would in fact ever have to be applied. Now we got to get ourselves out from under it. The sanctions long term make very little sense for the United States, I must tell you. They make very little sense. We want to have a strong India and Pakistan. We want them to work with us in this part of the world. We want to have commerce, and we want them to sign non-proliferation and test ban treaties. And I hope we'll be able to do that, and I hope these sanctions aren't in effect too long. China is a different, altogether different set of circumstances. China is a superpower. It is a huge economy. It's a huge market. The United States is yielding to that type of economic pressure. I honestly believe that our policies in China were established by economic interest and not any other foreign policy consideration. Huge U.S. financial interest wanted the market in China and wanted to be able to do what they're doing now and have little concern about human rights. That won the day in Washington and has continued to win the day.
Honorable Cardin, I have great respect and appreciation for the knowledge you just shared with us regarding the foreign affairs, specifically the Middle East knowledge. It's a very vertical knowledge. I have a lot of respect for it. You touch on many issues, and one thing I would like if you may, your comments regarding situation in Lebanon. Currently, we have 3 unwelcome guests in the country. They've been there for decades. They are the Syrian, the Iranian, and the Israeli. The Israeli, we understand, they telling us they are for security reasons. We all understand it. There wasn't government there, and I think they had some right to protect their people and the boundary. One thing I don't understand, why the Syrian is still there, why the Iranian is still there, and at the same time, these people really beating the heck out of liberty, integrity, the freedom of the people. They put in people in jails. They take them to Syria. They never come back, and they kick them out of the country. And at the same time, I think Lebanese all over the world, they're well known for what they do, for their business ethic and so forth. And they work closely with the United States. And they are, I'll bet you, in a million in the United States. At the same time, United States government somehow being passive. Mm-hmm. So I would like your comments, if you may.
Well, Lebanon is a country that has been basically invaded and taken over. They have not been able to control their borders. They have not been able to control who comes and goes through their country. It is used as a haven for terrorist activities from other countries, including Syria, as you pointed out. So the difficulty we have with Lebanon is that we would love to have a stable government that could control the borders, in which we could work out a peace accord, including with the Israelis, that would allow Lebanon to continue to grow as a prosperous country. It has a very proud history. It is a country that has a lot of strength, but unless you can control the use of Lebanon by Syria and others, you're going to be very difficult for us to figure out a peace arrangement where Lebanon will be able to grow and become once again a major country for tourism and a major country for economic growth, which it was. It was a beautiful country. And we look forward to the day where it once again will be a beautiful country. We don't have problem with the Lebanese. We have problems with other people coming into Lebanon.
Yeah. The Honorable Sir, something interesting happened this morning back in Africa. It's reported that the military head of state in Nigeria died of a heart attack this morning. And as we speak, the military leadership are meeting, trying to come up with a plan of action because there is a vacuum in leadership. Mm-hmm. There is no second in command. And with the situation back in Nigeria, it is my fear that there could be the developing of a major crisis in that subcontinent. And can I use this opportunity to probably urge you and your colleagues in Congress to really come up with a realistic approach to solving the problem in Nigeria for once and for all. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate I did not know about that, and I appreciate the information. The President's recent trip to Africa, I think, was a very huge success. I've talked to many of my colleagues that joined him for part, in some cases all of his trip to Africa. And I was impressed by the strategies of dealing with Africa's stronger growth with the United States. We expect to pass some legislation in this Congress that will expand upon the trade relations between Africa and the United States. We hope to move that forward. The one thing that impressed me is the diversity within Africa. It's hard to generalize among the different countries because they're all so different. Nigeria, the point that you mentioned, is very much understood, and I would hope that our country again would facilitate to make sure that stability and political leadership is maintained in Nigeria.
Congressman, a few years ago, we had a chance to participate in a small group discussion just before the vote on NAFTA agreement with Mexico. And you pointed out that while you personally felt very strongly that the agreement should be signed, that when you went back to your constituents, you were going to encounter just what you mentioned earlier tonight. We don't want one job going into Mexico. We don't want to spend $1 on that kind of an agreement until we've taken care of things back here at home. I wonder, in the years that have ensued, since you've several times mentioned tonight there wasn't a groundswell for this, that, or the other, that we have become pretty much an island unto ourselves in terms of the man on the street. We have a very healthy economy here. Why do we need to worry about things overseas? And I wonder if that attitude, that parochial attitude, hasn't in fact strengthened, and not for the betterment of the United States, by the way. And how do you, as a congressman, reconcile what you believe is right for the United States in some of these matters versus what your constituents feel at home? Because, as you pointed out in that little group, there are the folks that put you in office.
Right. Well, it's an excellent question. And you start off with the premise that it is obvious that we must be engaged in international commerce. That's obvious. Now, you might have to expand a little bit on it, but it's in our economic interest to sell our goods internationally and to import products that we need. And you start with some of the easier ones where we don't have natural resources and we have to import natural resources that are used in manufacturing. And come on down to our port here in Baltimore and we'll show you the resources coming in from other countries that are used for manufacturing in the United States. You expand that to the products that we have made that we have jobs here because of the exports. The Port of Baltimore, how important that is to our economy. You could go through it, and it becomes somewhat obvious that international trade is important interest of the United States. But we have sort of lined up on two sides of this issue, and we're not listening to each other. And that's the reason why Fast Track had trouble in the last year, and will continue to have problems, won't pass. It's not because people are opposed to more international trade agreements. Most members of Congress support that, even though it may be controversial in their districts, because they realize the importance of moving forward with trade. It's that both sides have taken now what I think are extreme, historic positions rather than looking as to where we are today. There are those in the labor movement today who are going to be opposed, and in the consumer movements, that are going to be opposed to any type of international agreements. They're just old-time protectionists now. They just don't want to even get involved in any debate on trade. That's unfortunate. That's unfortunate. But there's those on the other side of the coin that say, look, we should engage in free trade, we should bring back whatever agreements we can, and we shouldn't really get involved in extraneous issues. We shouldn't be concerned about labor rights in other countries. We shouldn't be concerned about environmental rights in other countries. We shouldn't be concerned about safety rights in other countries. But if you look at what is affecting international competition today, it's that we're not on a level playing field on these issues. And they are legitimate issues to negotiate internationally. They're not going to be easy issues. They're going to be difficult issues, particularly on the environment. Environment knows no country border. It's in our environmental interests, as well as in our economic interests, to be aggressive internationally in negotiating environmental standards. CEO of a major company here in Baltimore told me, look, if you don't put environment in the negotiating format, I can't compete internationally. That's the issue that I need the USTR negotiating so that I can get better access in international competition. So we should be aggressively saying, yes, we want to negotiate fair trade agreements with Chile and with South America and with Africa and with Europe. We want that in Asia. We want more trade agreements. But the ground rules for the debate shouldn't be limited to the narrow issues of tariffs or non-tariff trade barriers. They should be expanded to include environment and labor and safety and those issues. And let us negotiate. We can't dictate. Two have to agree, but at least aggressively go out after these issues. And if we saw a White House or a congressional leadership that was really serious about these issues, I am convinced that the same vote that passed NAFTA would pass fast track and trade legislation in Washington if we had that commitment to aggressively work. Because you know something? The United States has the toughest standards for industry on environment and safety and labor. We can't lose in those types of debate. Worst can happen is the president can't bring back any improvements, but at least give him the authority to do it. The last fast-track legislation did not give the president the authority to negotiate that. He couldn't even bring it back to Congress. I think that's ridiculous. Now, why did we do that? Again, it comes back to the commercial interest. Quite frankly, there are multinational companies that want cheap labor abroad, that want ineffective environmental standards abroad, because they can get cheaper products brought into the United States. That's not my interest. And we should be working for this country and be willing to say, yes, we want international trade, but we should give the president the power to negotiate what's in the best interest of our country, including stronger international standards on labor and environment.
Mr. Cardin, would you be willing to support the democratization of American foreign policy by allowing individual American citizens to support whom they wish, to get involved in whatever issues they wish, and avoid having it controlled by career diplomats and politicians who are much more subject to bribery of various sorts and ideology?
Somehow I got a feeling this is a trick question. I'm not sure. It depends on who's included in that group of politicians, I guess. I think I'm going to pass on that. Our foreign policy is conducted primarily through the executive branch of government. Yes, Congress has a very important role in foreign policy, very important role. But the principal role rests with the executive branch, the president. And yes, the citizens of this country have a very important role in any governmental policy decision. This is an open democracy. You impact on all policy decisions, including foreign policy. So I think there is impact that we all have on our foreign policy. It has been, we have felt that in many different areas. I just encourage you all to stay active on foreign policy, but I'm not sure we should change the rules for how foreign policy is actually developed and implemented in the United States.
The first, how long has it been since we paid our UN debt, and how much do we owe? And secondly, what's happening with inspections in Iraq?
Right. Well, on UN debt, there has been at times where we have disputed some of the monies that we have owed, so there's not always been a definitive amount of money that is been agreed to that the U.S. should pay. We have conditioned some of our payments upon reforms. Some of those reforms were made, and some of those payments were made over time. I don't really know how long it's been, but I know ever since I've been in Congress, we've owed money to the United Nations. So I think it's been a long-standing debate between the United States and the United Nations. The issue now is clear. We know how much money we owe. There's really no dispute about it. It's just a matter of paying it. I'm not sure of the exact amount of money. It's in the hundreds of millions, but I'm not sure of the exact sum. Does someone here know the total amount? 1.4? I didn't think it was that much. That sounds high. Well, I'm sorry, I just don't remember the exact amount. As far as inspections in Iraq, we had a briefing a couple weeks ago where the U.S. was satisfied that the inspections were taking place the way that they were supposed to be taking place. They did not want to make any public statements, basically, because there was still very much uncertainty as to whether the cooperation would continue. The strategy of the United States has basically been right now that we're not going to cause a lot of public attention on this if we're getting the types of verifications that we think are important, or we're making progress to getting that. The State Department was satisfied that progress was being made and that it would not be productive to try to discuss this in the public forum at this particular moment. So that's why there's been somewhat of a lull in the discussion of the inspections in the Iraq. It's a very, the situation could change at any time. The bottom line is that we do not have enough international support for military action right now. And it would hurt us internationally if we try to do this alone. We may have to, but it would really, you're talking about Russia and the problems with NATO. If we start using military force in Iraq, it's going to cause serious problems in our relationships with Russia and other countries.
We've had a long-standing policy at the Council of inviting our national representatives, elected representatives who have a responsibility for foreign affairs in some capacity, so that we can democratically get a look at them. And of course, Mr. Cardin always presents a very clear picture of where he stands. And we're delighted to hear that. It's also a very interesting evening. And of course, Mr. Cardin has served on our Board of Trustees and is a good friend of the Council. It's always a pleasure to have him. We thank him again for a wonderful evening.